The spring of 1945 arrived not with celebration, but with the slow, grinding disintegration of a regime that had consumed a continent. Across what remained of the Third Reich, the machinery of authority began to fail in stages. First, the grand proclamations went silent, then the supply chains collapsed, and finally, the structures of command simply vanished. In those final weeks, as Allied forces moved through shattered cities and liberated camps, they encountered not just the victims of Nazi policy, but also those who had enforced it. Among them were thousands of women whose roles within the system had been largely invisible during the war years, hidden behind the more prominent figures of military leadership and party hierarchy. Now, with the collapse of protective structures, these women found themselves suddenly exposed to a world that had not yet decided what justice would look like. The women who emerged from this wreckage occupied a complex position within the Nazi apparatus. They had served as guards in concentration camps, as auxiliaries in occupied territories, as clerks who processed deportation orders, as informants who identified resistance members, and as enforcers who maintained discipline within institutions designed to break human beings. Their participation had often been framed in bureaucratic language, their actions categorized as administrative duties or security responsibilities. The regime had normalized their presence within spaces of violence, transforming brutality into routine work that could be performed during daylight hours and abandoned at shift's end. For years, this normalization had allowed many of these women to exist within the system without confronting the full weight of what they were facilitating. The uniform provided protection, the hierarchy offered justification, and the ideology supplied moral cover for actions that would have seemed unthinkable in another context. When Allied forces entered German territory, they brought with them not just military power, but also documentation, testimony, and a growing awareness of what had occurred in the camps and killing sites scattered across Europe. Survivors began to speak, sometimes immediately, sometimes only after weeks of recovery. Their accounts named specific individuals, described particular acts of cruelty, and identified women whose faces they remembered from moments of suffering. For those who had served in these institutions, the collapse of Nazi authority meant the sudden removal of every structure that had legitimized their actions. The legal framework that had authorized their roles disappeared overnight. The ideological justifications that had sustained their participation lost all credibility. The hierarchies that had distributed responsibility across multiple levels of command fractured completely, leaving each individual isolated with the consequences of their own choices. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, chaos reigned across occupied Germany. Displaced persons camps swelled with survivors, refugees, former forced laborers, and released prisoners. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure had been destroyed, and civil administration existed only where Allied military governments chose to establish it. Within this confusion, the process of identifying perpetrators began unevenly. Some women were recognized immediately by survivors who pointed them out during liberation. Others attempted to blend into civilian populations, discarding uniforms and destroying documents that might connect them to their wartime roles. Still others remained in place, sometimes out of belief that their actions had been lawful, sometimes because they had nowhere else to go. The occupation forces faced an enormous task of sorting through millions of individuals, determining degrees of complicity, and establishing procedures for justice that could function in a devastated landscape. The exposure these women faced came in multiple forms. There was the physical exposure of being identified, arrested, and placed in detention facilities where they awaited interrogation. There was the social exposure of having their wartime roles revealed to communities that had known them as neighbors, colleagues, or family members. And there was the moral exposure of confronting what they had done without the protective framework of institutional authority. Fear dominated this period. Fear of retribution from survivors, fear of Allied prosecution, fear of public rage, and perhaps most deeply, fear of having to acknowledge the truth of their own participation. Denial became a common response. Denial of knowledge, denial of responsibility, denial of cruelty. Many claimed they had only followed orders, that they had been powerless within the system, that they had not known the full extent of what was happening. These defenses would be tested in the months and years that followed, as the machinery of post-war justice slowly began to turn. The collapse had been sudden, but the reckoning would be prolonged, uneven, and incomplete. What remained clear in those early weeks was that a threshold had been crossed. The structures that had made atrocity possible had fallen, and those who had operated within them now stood exposed in the ruins of what they had helped to build. To understand how thousands of women became participants in the Nazi system of terror, one must first understand the landscape they inhabited before the uniform, before the camp gates, before the moment when cruelty became routine. These were not women born into violence, but rather individuals who were shaped by a regime that understood how to transform ordinary people into instruments of its will. The process began long before anyone raised a hand in violence. It began with words, with symbols, with the gradual redrawing of moral boundaries, until what had once been unthinkable became simply another aspect of daily life. The Nazi regime invested enormous resources in ideological conditioning. From the moment it seized power in 1933, it worked to reshape German society according to its vision of racial hierarchy and national destiny. Women were central to this vision, framed as guardians of racial purity and bearers of the future. The Bund Deutsche Medal, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, taught young women that their loyalty to the Führer superseded all other obligations. Service to the state was presented not as a burden, but as the highest form of feminine virtue. This indoctrination was reinforced through every available channel. Radio broadcasts, newsreels, public rallies, school curricula and workplace organizations all repeated the same messages about duty, sacrifice, and the existential threat posed by racial enemies. The repetition was deliberate, designed to create a psychological environment where questioning became difficult and dissent seemed like betrayal. Within this environment, the leap from ideology to action was made to seem natural, even necessary. Social pressure played an equally important role in drawing women into the system. In a totalitarian state, refusal carried consequences: loss of employment, social isolation, suspicion from authorities, and potential danger to family members. Conversely, participation brought tangible benefits. Women who joined the SS auxiliary services or accepted positions in occupied territories received salaries that exceeded what they could earn in civilian life. They gained authority over others, a form of power that many had never previously experienced. They were told they were contributing to something historically significant, that their work mattered to the survival of the nation. These incentives were not accidental. The regime understood that compliance could be purchased through a combination of material reward and psychological validation. Personal ambition also factored into many decisions to join the system. Some women saw opportunities for advancement that would have been closed to them in peacetime civilian life. Others were drawn by a genuine belief in Nazi ideology, convinced that they were serving a greater good. Still others simply drifted into roles without fully considering where those roles might lead, making small compromises that accumulated over time into profound complicity. The regime normalized brutality through a carefully constructed hierarchy of command and responsibility. Orders flowed downward through clear chains of authority, allowing individuals at each level to tell themselves they were simply doing their jobs. The dehumanization of victims was systematic and deliberate. Jews, Slavs, Roma, political prisoners, and others designated as enemies were stripped of their humanity through language, through policy, and through daily treatment that reinforced their status as something less than human. When a prisoner was reduced to a number, when starvation made individuals unrecognizable, when disease and exhaustion transformed people into shadows, it became easier for guards and administrators to justify their actions. This was not accidental, but rather the intended psychological effect of the camp system itself. The blurring of responsibility was another crucial mechanism. Within large institutions where many people performed small tasks, it became possible to avoid confronting the ultimate purpose of those tasks. A clerk processing transport lists could tell herself she was simply managing paperwork. A guard enforcing camp discipline could claim she was merely maintaining order. An auxiliary in an occupied territory could frame her work as administrative support. Each role, taken in isolation, could be presented as morally neutral, divorced from the final outcome. Yet complicity was a gradual process, not a single moment of decision. It began with small compromises, accepting a position, following an order that seemed harsh but not criminal, remaining silent when witnessing cruelty, hardening oneself against the suffering of others. Each compromise made the next one easier, until the distance between the person one had been and the person one had become seemed unbridgeable. The regime understood this psychology and exploited it deliberately. It created systems where refusal at any single point seemed disproportionate to what was being asked, even as the cumulative effect was profound moral corruption. This chapter does not excuse the choices these women made. Understanding the mechanisms of complicity is not the same as absolving responsibility, but it does illuminate how ordinary individuals became capable of extraordinary cruelty, not through sudden transformation, but through incremental steps that reshaped their moral landscape. The ideology provided the framework, the social pressure provided the push, and personal ambition provided the pull. Together, these forces created a system where participation in atrocity became, for many, simply another aspect of wartime service. The roles women played within the Nazi apparatus of terror were diverse, but they shared a common characteristic. They involved the exercise of power over those who had been stripped of all protection. In concentration camps across Germany and occupied territories, female guards enforced a regime designed to degrade, exhaust, and ultimately destroy human beings. These guards wore grey uniforms, carried whips and clubs, and possessed the authority to punish prisoners for infractions real or imagined. Their cruelty was not always spectacular or overt, but rather embedded in the daily routines that governed camp life. Morning roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing weather, forced labor assignments that exceeded human endurance, food rations calculated to produce slow starvation, punishments that ranged from beatings to solitary confinement in standing cells. The guards who administered this system did so with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but all participated in its fundamental purpose. Some became known for particular brutality, dogs set upon prisoners, whippings administered with methodical violence, selections that sent the weak to death. Others maintained a colder, more bureaucratic approach, enforcing rules without visible emotion but with complete consistency. In both cases, the effect was the same. Suffering was administered daily, quietly, and systematically. Beyond the camps, women served in occupied territories as auxiliaries to military and police units. They worked in administrative offices where deportation orders were processed, where lists of hostages were compiled, where resources seized from murdered populations were catalogued and distributed. They served as nurses in facilities where disabled children were killed as part of the euthanasia program. They worked as secretaries for Einsatzgruppen commanders, typing reports that documented mass shootings with clinical precision. They operated switchboards that connected the various components of the killing apparatus, facilitating communication between those who ordered atrocities and those who carried them out. The power these women exercised often emerged from seemingly routine actions. A clerk who processed a transport list determined who would be deported and when. An informant who reported on resistance activities could condemn entire families to arrest and execution. A camp guard who decided which prisoners would receive medical care and which would be left to die exercised life and death authority through administrative discretion. The bureaucratic nature of these roles did not diminish their impact, but rather enabled them to function more efficiently. Surveillance was another form of power that women exercised within the system. In camps in occupied territories and within Germany itself, women monitored prisoners, forced laborers, and suspect populations. They reported infractions, identified escape attempts, and provided intelligence that fed into the security apparatus. This surveillance was constant and pervasive, creating an environment where privacy did not exist, and where any moment of weakness or resistance could be observed and punished. The psychological effect was intentional, to break the will through the knowledge that one was always being watched. Punishment, when it came, was often administered by women against women prisoners. Female guards in camps like Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz-Birkenau were responsible for maintaining discipline within the women's sections. This meant beatings, forced standing in punishment blocks, denial of food, and the selection of prisoners for execution or medical experimentation. The cruelty involved was sometimes personal, driven by sadism or rage, but more often it was mechanical, performed as part of the daily routine without particular emotion. This normalization of violence was perhaps more disturbing than overt brutality, because it revealed how completely the infliction of suffering had been integrated into ordinary work. Silence was itself a form of complicity. Women who witnessed atrocities but said nothing, who knew what was happening in other parts of the camp or in nearby killing sites but chose not to acknowledge it, participated through their refusal to speak. The regime counted on this silence, understanding that most people would choose self-preservation over moral courage. And for the most part, this calculation proved correct. The system functioned because thousands of individuals performed their assigned roles without protest, without question, and without allowing themselves to fully confront what they were facilitating. The harm these women inflicted was systemic rather than isolated. It was not a matter of individual acts of violence, though those occurred, but rather the sustained administration of suffering through institutional procedures. Prisoners died not just from beatings but from starvation, from disease, from exhaustion, from despair. They died because the system was designed to kill them, and everyone who operated within that system contributed to its function. The guards who enforced labor quotas, the clerks who recorded deaths, the administrators who managed resources, the informants who identified resistance, all were necessary components of a machine built for destruction. By the time Allied forces liberated the camps, the evidence of what had occurred was overwhelming. Mass grave crematoria meticulously kept records, and the testimony of survivors left no room for doubt about the nature of the system or the roles played by those who had staffed it. The women who had served as guards, auxiliaries, and administrators could no longer hide behind bureaucratic language or claims of ignorance. What they had done was visible in the bodies of the survivors, in the documentation they themselves had created, and in the physical infrastructure of the camps. The crimes had been committed quietly, routinely, and efficiently, but they had been committed nonetheless, and now they would have to be answered for. The machinery of justice that followed liberation was improvised, inconsistent, and overwhelmed by the scale of what it confronted. In the immediate aftermath of the camp's liberation, Allied forces faced a landscape of atrocity that defied their existing legal frameworks and moral categories. The women who had served within the Nazi system were among those who now faced arrest, interrogation, and the prospect of punishment, but the process by which this occurred varied enormously depending on location, timing, and the particular Allied power in charge of a given territory. Some women were arrested within hours of liberation, identified by survivors who pointed them out as guards or administrators. These arrests were often chaotic. Driven by the raw emotion of newly freed prisoners and the shock of Allied soldiers who were confronting the reality of the camps for the first time. Documentation was scarce in these early days. Prisoners who could barely stand gave testimony. Soldiers who had no training in criminal investigation attempted to gather evidence. The women themselves, still wearing their grey uniforms or hastily discarded civilian clothes, offered denials, justifications, and claims of ignorance. Many were placed in detention facilities to await formal proceedings, but in the chaos of those first weeks, the line between detention and retribution was often unclear. Military tribunals became the primary mechanism for prosecuting those accused of war crimes. The most prominent of these was the Belsen trial, held by British forces in the autumn of 1945. 45 defendants stood accused of crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, including multiple female guards and administrators. The trial lasted nearly 2 months. Survivors testified about specific acts of cruelty, beatings, selections, deliberate starvation, and murder. The accused offered various defenses. Some claimed they had only followed orders. Others insisted they had tried to help prisoners within the limits of their authority. A few admitted their actions, but framed them as necessary for maintaining order within an impossible situation. The court was not persuaded by these arguments. 11 defendants were sentenced to death, including 3 women. The sentences were carried out by hanging in December 1945. Other trials followed. The Americans prosecuted guards and administrators at Dachau, Mauthausen, and other camps within their occupation zone. The Soviets conducted their own proceedings in territories under their control, often with less concern for procedural standards and more emphasis on swift retribution. The French prosecuted collaborators and camp personnel in their zone and in territories that had been under Vichy control. The proceedings varied in their formality, their standards of evidence, and their willingness to accept defenses based on following orders or ignorance of broader crimes. But formal trials represented only one form of post-war justice. Summary punishments were more common in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Some women accused of collaboration or cruelty were subjected to public humiliation, their heads shaved, their bodies marked, paraded through streets by crowds seeking visible retribution. Others were imprisoned without trial, held in detention facilities for months or years before their cases were resolved. Still others faced extrajudicial execution, killed by former prisoners, resistance members, or vigilante groups who took justice into their own hands. The legal framework that governed these prosecutions was itself evolving. The concept of crimes against humanity was formalized at Nuremberg, but its application to low-level perpetrators remained unclear. Questions arose about whether following orders constituted a valid defense, whether ignorance of the broader criminal enterprise mattered, and whether administrative roles carried the same culpability as direct violence. Different courts reached different conclusions on these questions. The lack of consistency troubled some observers, who worried that justice was being distributed unevenly. Others argued that the unprecedented nature of Nazi crimes required flexibility in prosecution. The gender of the accused complicated proceedings in ways that were not always acknowledged. Some judges and prosecutors seemed uncertain how to categorize the crimes of female guards and administrators. Traditional legal frameworks had not anticipated women exercising the kind of power these individuals had held. Some defendants attempted to exploit this uncertainty, presenting themselves as subordinate figures who had lacked agency within a male-dominated system. These claims rarely succeeded when confronted with survivor testimony, but they reflected broader social discomfort with acknowledging the full scope of female participation in atrocity. By the early 1950s, the intensity of prosecution had diminished significantly. Cold War politics reshaped priorities, and the desire to move forward competed with the imperative to hold perpetrators accountable. Many women who had served in the Nazi system were released from detention after serving relatively short sentences. Others were never prosecuted at all, either because evidence was insufficient, because they had successfully concealed their wartime roles, or because Allied authorities lacked the resources to pursue every case. The result was a patchwork of justice, some punished severely, others punished minimally, and many not punished at all. For those who were executed or imprisoned, the punishments represented a form of closure, however imperfect. Survivors who had testified felt that some measure of accountability had been achieved. Allied authorities demonstrated that war crimes would not be ignored, even when committed by those at lower levels of the hierarchy. But the limitations of post-war justice were also evident. The vast majority of individuals who had participated in the Nazi system never faced formal prosecution. The administrative machinery that had made atrocity possible was staffed by thousands, and only a small fraction ever stood before a court. The punishment of female guards and administrators, therefore, represented both an achievement and a failure. It acknowledged their guilt and imposed consequences for their actions, but it also revealed how difficult it is to achieve comprehensive justice in the aftermath of systemic atrocity, and how many who participated in evil simply fade back into ordinary life when the structures that enabled them collapse. In the decades that followed the end of the Second World War, a curious pattern emerged in how the crimes of the Nazi era were remembered and discussed. While male perpetrators, the architects of genocide, the commanders of death squads, the administrators of the final solution, occupied central positions in historical narratives and popular memory, the women who had participated in these same crimes faded into the background. This erasure was not accidental, but rather reflected deeper cultural assumptions about gender, violence, and moral responsibility. The women who had served as guards, auxiliaries, and administrators became marginal figures in post-war reckoning, their stories fragmented and their crimes often minimized. Part of this erasure stemmed from the relatively small numbers involved. Female guards and administrators represented a minority within the vast apparatus of Nazi terror. They did not hold the highest positions of authority, did not design the policies that led to genocide, and were not present at the conferences where the final solution was planned. This numerical and hierarchical reality made it easier to focus historical attention elsewhere, on those whose decisions had the broadest impact. But numbers alone do not explain why female perpetrators were remembered so differently from their male counterparts. Gender complicated perceptions of guilt in fundamental ways. Traditional assumptions held that women were naturally more compassionate, more nurturing, less capable of systematic cruelty than men. When women committed acts of violence within the camps or participated in the machinery of genocide, it created cognitive dissonance that societies struggled to resolve. Some observers responded by framing these women as aberrations, monstrous exceptions who bore no relation to ordinary femininity. Others minimized their agency, suggesting they had been coerced or manipulated by male authority figures. Both responses avoided confronting the uncomfortable reality that women could choose to participate in atrocity, that they could exercise power with cruelty, and that they were fully responsible for their actions. The trials of female guards generated intense public interest when they occurred. The image of women standing in the dock, accused of beating prisoners or selecting victims for execution, fascinated and disturbed observers. Media coverage often focused on their appearance, their demeanor, their claims of innocence. But this interest proved shallow and short-lived. Once the trials concluded and sentences were carried out, public attention moved elsewhere. The executed women became cautionary tales, briefly invoked and then forgotten. Those who survived imprisonment returned to obscurity. In Germany itself, the post-war period was marked by a desire to move forward, to rebuild, to avoid dwelling on the recent past. This tendency affected memory of all perpetrators, but it particularly impacted how female participants were remembered. The women who had served in camps or occupied territories often resumed ordinary lives after their release from detention. They married, raised families, found employment, and integrated back into communities that chose not to ask too many questions about the war years. The social fabric of post-war Germany depended on a degree of collective amnesia, and these women benefited from that amnesia like so many others who had participated in the regime. Historical research into female perpetrators remained limited for decades. Scholars focused on military history, on the decision-making of Nazi leadership, on the experiences of victims. The administrative and enforcement roles that women had played seemed less significant by comparison, mere details in a larger story of industrial genocide. When research did address these women, it often emphasized their subordinate positions within the hierarchy, inadvertently reinforcing the perception that their crimes mattered less than those committed by men. This began to change in the late 20th century as historians started examining the full scope of participation in Nazi crimes. New research revealed the extent to which women had been integrated into the machinery of terror, the ways they had exercised power, and the harm they had inflicted. Survivor testimonies, which had always contained detailed accounts of female guards and administrators, were given greater weight. Archival research uncovered documentation of women's roles in occupied territories, in euthanasia programs, and in administrative support for killing operations. The result was a more complete picture of how the Nazi system had functioned, one that acknowledged the participation of women not as exceptional cases, but as integral components of the apparatus. The long-term legacy of postwar punishments remained ambiguous. For survivors, the trials and executions had provided a measure of justice, proof that some perpetrators had been held accountable. But many survivors also felt that justice had been incomplete, that too many had escaped punishment, and that the sentences imposed had been inadequate given the magnitude of the crimes. The executions of female guards in particular generated mixed feelings, satisfaction that cruelty had been answered with consequence, but also awareness that execution of a handful of individuals could not address the systemic nature of what had occurred. For broader society, the punishments served as evidence that war crimes would not be tolerated, that those who participated in genocide would face consequences. Yet this message was undermined by the reality that most perpetrators never faced trial, and that Cold War politics soon took precedence over continued prosecution. The historical reckoning with female perpetrators matters for reasons beyond simple completeness. It challenges comfortable assumptions about gender and morality. It forces acknowledgement that atrocity is not the exclusive domain of men, that women are capable of cruelty, and that participation in systems of violence is not determined by biological sex, but by choice, ideology, and circumstance. It also illuminates the mechanisms through which ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The women who served in camps and occupied territories were not born monsters. They were products of a specific historical moment, shaped by ideological conditioning, social pressure, and personal ambition. Understanding their participation helps us understand how such systems function and how they might be prevented. The importance of historical clarity over myth or denial cannot be overstated. When societies forget or minimize certain aspects of atrocity, they lose the capacity to learn from those events. The women who participated in Nazi crimes must be remembered not as exceptions or aberrations, but as evidence of how deeply systems of violence can penetrate society. Their punishment, uneven and incomplete as it was, represented an attempt to impose moral consequence on those who had chosen complicity. The task for subsequent generations is to remember these events with accuracy, to resist the temptation toward comfortable myths, and to understand that accountability for atrocity must be comprehensive if it is to mean anything at all. The consequences of participating in systems of terror are enduring. They mark individuals, they shape histories, and they pose moral questions that persist long after the structures of violence have collapsed. The women who wore grey uniforms, who carried whips through camp yards, who processed deportation orders and reported on prisoners, they made choices that defined the rest of their lives. Some faced punishment, some escaped it, but none could escape the historical record of what they had done. That record stands as testimony, as warning, and as reminder of the cost of complicity.